When we are fasted, we tend to reduce the activity of a particular protein called mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin. mTOR is very active in cells while they are growing, so throughout development. It's also very active in cancers of various kinds. If this is all escaping you, don't worry about it. Phospho-mTOR and PS6 are reduced by fasting. Now, this makes sense if you think about it, because eating and growth are associated with each other.
Exactly.
Fasting is not necessarily anti-growth, but it is not pro-growth. And when we fast, we see increases in cells of things like AMPK, the sirtuins, things like transcription factors like Fox biology and biochemistry. It's to say that we have cell growth pathways involving mTOR and PS6, and we have cell repair and cell shrinkage processes that are associated with AMPK.
Rejuvenation. When you hit the 72-hour, no, the 50-hour mark in fasting, cells begin to rejuvenate, repair. That's how they work. Each cell in the mitochondria, which can help rejuvenate the whole cell, if you can activate this, if you can.
The so-called sirtuins, which Dr. David Sinclair from Harvard and others are famous for discovering and understanding, things like AMPK. These two different divergent pathways of cell growth and cell breakdown and repair, and by breakdown I mean actual clearance, autophagy, and repair, those can be triggered by being in either the fed or the fasted state. So one way I'd like you to think about the fed state, not just eating, but having recently eaten, or the fasted state, meaning high blood glucose and or you've recently eaten or are currently eating or drinking calories, is that when you eat or when you don't eat, when you're fed, when you're fasted, you are either promoting cellular growth of all kinds or you're promoting cellular repair and clearance of all kinds. And so again, this is about setting conditions in the brain and body.
Yes.
It's not so much about when you eat food
both.
A or B.
You cannot do both at the same time. You are eating and growing or not eating and repairing. That's the difference between fasting and always being eating and just wake up, eat all day for 16 hours and then go to sleep. Like, no, that's not gonna work. That's not how your body works. We have other pathogens that we can access in regards into like repair, clean out and repair damaged cells. It's fat.
For B, it leads to increases in mTOR. Anytime you eat any food, doesn't matter if it's plant-based, animal-based, fat, protein, carbohydrate, doesn't matter. You are biasing your system towards a biochemical state of cell growth. And anytime you haven't eaten for a while or blood glucose is low, you are biasing your system toward a state of cellular repair. And this is why people who do not suffer from any blood glucose regulation issues take things like berberine as glucose disposal agents, or take metformin. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you do that, but it's because those things mimic fasting. They create...
Mimic. He says it's not necessary, but they mimic fasting. Why mimic something when you can just straight up and do it and get the full benefits rather than still having repercussions? Because 100% of the time, concentrated pharmaceuticals is not good for your liver and kidneys. Plain and simple. Plain and simple. Like, there's no fact to saying that it's not.
Suggesting that you do that, but it's because those things...
Because those things mimic fasting. Mimic fasting. I want to realize it coming from his mouth saying it mimics fasting. And I agree, it mimics fasting. Why not do these other things that he already talked about, like being active, going for a walk after you eat. How about after you eat, you wash some dishes and stay active with kids and animals? You know what I mean? Like, that's easy. Being alive and being functional. I got a whole house. I got 2 kids, 2 dogs, 2 cats, and a pig. I can stay active. It's the means of getting this information out there, and this is what I do on my side, is research something I believe in, and fasting is the truth, and I'm not trying to mimic. I'm trying to get the word about being something real. That's why I like real fasting and really being in a state of ketosis and autophagy and being deep into ketosis and dropping my insulin sensitivity to the max and understanding what it feels like to move my blood glucose. Being deep in a fasting state, going into those 40 and 50 and 60, 70 and 100-hour days where I'm into fasting on a regular basis. Not just once a year, or I'm saying once a month. You should be doing something over 3 days on a weekly basis. Do 24s and 36s. It's possible. You can do it. Don't think you can't. How the human body works is not in the 24-hour stretch. It's actually more like a 5-day stretch on storing stuff you eat in one day. So let's not mimic things. Let's actually do them.
Things mimic fasting. They create situations in the body that promote things like AMPK and the sirtuins and others to push your body and your system down a route of repair, even though you might have just eaten a meal an hour ago. Along the lines of the health benefits of...
And to think about these drugs, that your body can get used to it. You get a tolerance for them, and one dose, once you start with, isn't going to be the same dose you're going to be ending up with in 5 years. And that's when you get a bad relationship with these pharmaceuticals and drugs because of how they're made.
Intermittent fasting. There are nice data showing improvements in the gut microbiome, and in particular in the treatment of irritable bowel syndrome and other forms of colitis in time-restricted feeding. Meaning time-restricted feeding seems to be able to assist people with those conditions, following the general parameters that I discussed before, 8 hours and so forth. It appears that intermittent fasting can reduce the amount of so-called lactobacillus that's present in the gut. And lactobacillus is, when in high levels, is correlated with a number of different metabolic.
I know. This is when he's simplifying things. The intermittent fasting reduce the amount of all these things that causes diseases.
Reduce the amount of so-called lactobacillus that's present in the gut. And lactobacillus is, when in high levels, is correlated with a number of different metabolic disorders. At the same time, time-restricted feeding seems to enhance the proliferation of some of the gut microbiota like Oscillobacter and some of the other ones that promote healthy mucosal lining and that promote better overall intestinal function. The other very exciting finding about intermittent fasting is one of the major health issues these days is the proliferation of so-called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. 30 years or so, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease was exceedingly rare to see in the clinic, except in alcoholics. Fatty deposits in the liver are bad. It is essentially liver disease. Nowadays, children and adults are showing up with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Some of these people are obese, others are not. But it's a serious health concern, and it's growing in numbers.
Some of these people are obese and some of these people are not. That's why I get on top of some people. They think they're just skinny and they're all right. Nah, big homie. That doesn't mean a whole lot of things. Like, the human evolution is so tricky that you shouldn't follow that path just because, oh, I'm skinny. And there's a lot of skinny people that just drop dead too, just like obese people. So don't get it twisted when you're thinking, oh, these diseases are bypassing me just because you're skinny and you ate a whole lot your whole life and you never really got fat. Well, other people get fat and get obese because they overeat and because they easy.
Or so-called brown fat tissue is impacting the liver health and in particular non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Brown fat, which is a healthy fat that we have between our two scapulae and in our upper neck. It doesn't tend to be blubbery type fat pads, but it sits deep to the skin but creates a thermogenic effect in the body that is helpful for reducing the amount of other fat, the type of fat that we're more typically used to thinking about and talking about, white fat and pink fat, that's subcutaneous fat around the abdomen and so forth. Brown fat seems to have a direct correlation with the lack of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. What this study showed was that in people that have diminished concentrations of brown fat, there is a higher probability of having non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Now, the good news is brown fat stores can be increased. And again, this isn't going to create blubber of brown fat. This is going to create increased thermogenesis and actually make people leaner. And brown fat has a number of other important positive effects. Now, this is interesting because cold exposure of anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes, 2 or 4 times per week, or maybe even 10 minutes, 2 to 4 times per week, can increase brown fat stores. Also, time-restricted feeding has now been tied to the density of brown fat stores. So time-restricted feeding...
I've been doing this in a combination for the last 3 years, and yes, this is why I get deeper into fasting and weight loss is stay at a minimum, because brown fat is it's like a healthier fat. Your body really don't want to lose it, so it goes through other sources and other repercussions, and brown fat is way more healthier, but it is a denser fat inside of your body too, but it's also a thermogenic regulator. Like, it's more like your body can communicate with this fat better than the other fat that they're selling you on. Your body craves this fat in a certain way too. You get into it.
Eating also seems to positively increase brown fat stores, probably because of the way that brown fat stores relate to epinephrine and adrenaline, which tend to go up when we're fasted. What does this all mean? This means, for sake of liver health and for sake of reducing or maybe preventing or even potentially, I want to underline potentially, reversing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, time-restricted feeding also appears to be beneficial. So the takeaway is, for sake of hormone health, time-restricted feeding is compatible with quality hormone health, even in high-performing athletes. Based on everything we know and that we've discussed, I would not suggest that people restrict their feeding window to less than 8 hours, especially if they're training hard on a regular basis. And it's not just athletes that should pay attention to this. When we are working very hard, when we are psychologically stressed, when we are studying for exams, or we are in conflict with somebody on a regular basis, that creates a stress in the body that's very similar to that of physical training. The body and brain don't distinguish between physical stress and mental stress. It's all nervous system. Remember that. It's just cortisol and adrenaline. There's no special hormone just for physical stress versus psychological stress. So again, in thinking about what sort of feeding window will be right for you, we arrive back at this 8-hour time bin that seems more or less flexible for most conditions, even high-performing elite athletes, and I would say, just by logical extension, even for people that have a lot of stress in their life. And I personally wouldn't suggest that people who have a lot of stress in their life or the potential for stress in their life shorten their feeding window much shorter than 8 hours. Some people do not do well on intermittent fasting, either in terms of mood or hormone health. And so everyone needs to determine for themselves whether or not having a time-restricted feeding window is good for them, how long that time-restricted feeding window should be. I think 8 hours is kind of a nice minimum to adhere to based on everything that we've covered today. Yeah. I keep coming back to this 8-hour feeding window, and I want to provide a little more basis for it, and just to encourage that it's not completely arbitrary. The lengthy review that I mentioned earlier features a number of studies that have used this 8-hour feeding window. But there's a particular study that I'd like to highlight, mainly because I don't expect people to delve into the full reference list of the other review. And this is a study that was carried out between Sachin Panda's lab and Krista Verity's lab. So this is a collaboration. The study was carried out in humans and is entitled Effects of 8-Hour Time-Restricted Feeding on Body Weight and Metabolic Disease Risk Factors in Obese Adults. And this study essentially showed, I'll just read the conclusions, that an 8-hour time-restricted feeding produces a mild caloric restriction and weight loss without calorie counting. So that's key, right? These people aren't calorie counting. Somehow, just by adhering to an 8-hour window, they are taking in fewer calories than they're burning off. And clinically, it reduced blood pressure. So I mention the study not because there aren't many others involving the 8-hour feeding window, also in humans, but because the 8-hour feeding window has been tested in obese adults and non-obese adults, and there are even a few studies in children. So this 8-hour window seems to be a really good rule of thumb and a kind of anchor around which we can each think about incorporating time-restricted feeding. There are, of course, other patterns of feeding, and while some people have engaged in longer fasts of 24 hours, 36 hours or more, alternate day fasting, meaning eating one day, not eating the next day, or in some cases eating one day and eating very few calories, 500 or 600 calories the next day, has been tested. A few studies have also looked at eating a sort of maintenance level of calories for 5 days and then taking 2 days and fasting clear through, or eating very few calories, 300 or 500 calories. In fact, there's a sort of a community online of people that are exploring longer fasts for sake of trying to offset dementia or reverse effects of dementia. Thus far, at least in my awareness, there isn't any quality clinical peer-reviewed study on that yet for sake of dementia, although I await those studies, and if anyone's aware of them, please send me a link in the comments. But alternate day fasting has gotten the so-called safe bill of health. This has been written up, meaning that people didn't suffer bone loss, they didn't suffer any major detrimental effects. It does seem that it can create significant weight loss and can help with obese individuals, that it can reduce resting blood glucose, and every other day fasting in many cases can produce more rapid effects on weight loss and reductions in blood glucose than time-restricted feeding. However, every other day type fasting for most people is not going to be feasible. They're just not going to be able to do that for a long period of time. And what hasn't really been done is the follow-up to see whether or not people who do every other day fasting or 5 days of eating followed by 2 days of fasting, whether or not that leads to a rebound in weight gain, whether or not that leads to a rebound in blood glucose, etc. So for now, the 8-hour feeding window and time-restricted feeding seems to be the most tested, supported in animal studies and in human studies, and the one around which I think most people should orient if they're considering getting into time-restricted feeding. It's also sort of hard to imagine how one could include a significant exercise schedule or work schedule on every other day fasting. Remember, in any study, people are often being compensated or at least are incentivized in some way to adhere to the study. This is one of the major issues that I have with any study that says that 3 or 4 different diets are essentially equal in terms of their ability to produce weight loss. Adherence is very different in the outside world, where you don't have a researcher monitoring you, where you're not logging all your food. Most people don't do that consistently. And we can take a little bit of a neuroscience perspective on this to try and arrive at what the best kind of organization of an eating plan, or if we wanted to call it a diet, would be for you. Many people find it easier to just not eat for certain periods of each 24-hour cycle than to eat smaller portions. Portion control is very hard for some people. For other people, it's manageable. And I mention work and mental focus because one of the aspects of fasting that have drawn a lot of people to time-restricted feeding and fasting is the clarity of mind that people get.
Yes, that's what
when, first of all, they don't have to think about when they're going to eat because they know when their eating window begins.
Exactly.
They also don't have to think about regulating their behavior because they already know when they're going to eat and when they're not going to eat. Whereas when you're restricting portions, you actually have to make decisions all the while. And I think I, like many people, decide, well, is that exactly half, or could I have like another rung on the croissant, this kind of thing. I don't negotiate with food. That's why I like a time-restricted feeding window. I know I'm going to eat in my case, I use a 10-hour feeding window or so, and I'll eat the whole croissant. I just don't have to think about it. Now, the food choices that you make inside of that feeding window are, of course, also going to be very important. Certain foods will increase blood glucose such that you're going to get hungrier and hungrier. Others will maintain lower blood glucose and will allow you to be more controlled in the foods that you pursue. Those are all individual considerations that are deserving of their own entire episode, but I do want to point out that the advantage of time-restricted feeding is that it involves a lot of the decision-making in the brain, the so-called go, no-go circuitries of our basal ganglia, if you want to know the areas that control them. Anytime we have to restrict a behavior, that's called a no-go. Anytime we engage in a behavior, that's a go. No-go behaviors require a lot of what's called top-down control, and it's very metabolically demanding. And so time-restricted feeding allows you to depart from the whole no-go, go negotiation that you have to undergo when you have to restrict portions. This is covered in the review that I mentioned earlier that describes how if people follow a time-restricted feeding schedule for long periods of time, so 60 days or longer, there's some metabolic changes in the way that people metabolize energy that do seem to shift the system toward more fat loss relative to burning of other tissues when in a state of caloric restriction. And I want to say when in a state of caloric restriction because there's really no way to cheat the system. There's no way that you can ingest far more calories than you burn or excrete. In general, calories in versus calories out, as I mentioned earlier, is this kind of foundational element. But in states of caloric restriction, meaning sub-maintenance intake, time-restricted feeding does seem to bias more of the energy burned to compensate for that deficit from fat. And the way it accomplishes it is very interesting. It turns out that it drives more fat loss by way of increasing a hepatic lipase. So extended periods of time-restricted feeding, meaning 8-hour feeding window or 10-hour feeding window that's obeyed for several months or more, seems to allow the system to shift toward burning more fat, or rather using a higher percentage of fat when in a caloric deficit. Now, I doubt that this is going to resolve the truly barbed wire, almost hairball, ridiculous online debates about whether or not time-restricted feeding is better than another feeding schedule. Look, I don't think any particular feeding schedule is holy. If you are subcaloric, meaning fewer calories burned than calories ingested, you're going to lose weight. But the data seem to point to the fact that if you do time-restricted feeding for a fairly long duration of time and you maintain that you are increasing these lipases that increase lipolysis, energy use from fat, and you are decreasing the lipid droplet-associated lipolysis inhibitors. So it's both you're removing the brake and you're pressing on the accelerator of fat loss. And I think that this logically points to a case in which using time-restricted feeding with a subcaloric intake seems to be, at least to my mind, the most scientifically supported way to ensure that a significant portion of the weight that one loses is from body fat stores. Insofar as the scientific literature says, drinking water will not break your fast. Drinking tea will not break your fast. Drinking coffee, provided it is black coffee, will not break your fast. Ingesting caffeine in pill form will not break your fast. There are other things that won't break your fast. For instance, eating one peanut when deep in a fasted state will not break your fast. Eating a whole handful of peanuts might not even break your fast if you are in a very low glucose state. However, if you just finished a meal that included carbohydrates or it was a very large meal of any kind an hour ago, yes, indeed, eating one peanut could break your fast. Yeah. So it's all contextual. That's what's really important to understand. Unless you're going to wear a continuous glucose monitor, and unless you're going to wear a continuous glucose monitor and set an absolute numerical threshold for what it is to break your fast, I think there are some simple rules that we can follow.
Yep.
First of all, anything that involves sugar, in particular simple sugars, can potentially break your fast. And there's actually a study on this which shows that if people ingest even one gram of sugar post-dinner, if they had a full meal for dinner, that can actually disrupt the expression of some of the circadian genes related to fasting and to sleep and sleep-related fasting. Now, that's pretty extreme. It's almost kind of scary to think about. But that's how sensitive our system is if we already have somewhat elevated blood glucose from a meal that we ate an hour or so ago.
We're done.
Whereas if we have run for an hour or trained hard, high-intensity training.
My important thing that he talks about is like when you're deep into a fast, meaning deep into ketosis, 16 hours, you're into ketosis, 22 hours, you're deep into ketosis. I'm preaching over 20 hours on a regular and going to deep fasts up to 30, 36, 42, 48. Because once you have a little handful of peanuts that won't break your fast in a 20-hour state, it's double the power at a 40-hour period. And you're just going about having little snacks until your actual feast time. And I'm not saying, oh, you sit down for 8 hours and eat. Have your pyramid like I said I do. Start light, go heavy, and go back into light. And I don't rush it. I don't think about the time, especially after I do a big, like anything over 36 hours. My eating window is 8 to 10 hours. It depends, because like he said, when you stop eating, you still got 90 minutes. And if I ate a real dense meal, then I wasn't going too light. I really just spread out the density in that 8 hours, the last 2 hours or 3 hours, depending on what you eat. Like your glucose level is still going to be high. So when you get your glucose level down, that's when you're in a fasting state. But when you're deep into these fasting states, you're in high ketosis. You're burning at a high rate. You're burning deep fat in your body. Fresh fat you put in is gonna be like, it's just gonna blow. It's just gonna fucking blow that up. It's just gonna, like he's saying, like Dr. David Sinclair too. He's like, man, you have a slice of apple when you're deep in fasting. That ain't gonna break your fast. It's impossible. Or a spoonful of honey. Like no, it's not. It's impossible, because you gotta look at your body as a machine, not just a sack of fucking water and flesh. No, it's a fucking active machine that's connected to nothing, that can run on its own and think on its own and make decisions on its own. We just gotta follow the natural rhythm of it. And that's what people are totally missing, and they need to hold on to when people like him are talking. Like, yo, you just said in a deep fasting state, a handful of this won't break your fast. Yeah, man, because we're like a burning machine at that point. When you're deep into a fasting state, your body is burning. Already burned through the bad, the good, the bad, the ugly, and now it's only burning the good stuff. And you put fresh stuff in, it's gonna burn and keep going. Now you can think about your feast time and look like, yo, I'm maintaining weight. My body's making healthy fats rather than bad fats. Not this quick, fast, flubbery fat, making brown, healthy fats. And your body is a more tuned up machine rather than anything you catch will break you down and make you weak, and you're just sitting on the toilet stuck because your body don't want this in your body. You're not absorbing nothing. You think you're skinny, everything all good, but you're not absorbing nothing. You're not maintaining good weight. You just going by life thinking like, oh, I can eat whatever. Like, no, you can't. First of all, especially this made up food that people are making on a daily basis the last 250 years, just because we came out of a famine period. And using certain objects we use in famine to keep going, that we make on a daily basis and eat and think that's normal, and it's not. Humans been around for 100,000 years. You think what we created in the last 2,000 years is perfect for us to rely on every day? No. We got to come to the point that, yo, our bodies are machines that will run off any type of energy. Yeah, there's good, bad, and ugly energy out there, and you got to pick which one is the best energy source. We're going to get into that, but he's breaking down in this video, being in the fasting state, it's not what you eat, it's when you eat, and that's when your body is burning. And eating an 8 smaller hour window will benefit you to the max, period. I stick to 4 to 6 when I'm in, like right now it's holiday season in between, like I'm relaxing, I'm chill, but 9 out of 10 months, 10 out of 12 months, no, 11 out of 12 months, there's probably like 4 good weeks when I'm not fasting, and you put all the days up together that I'm not fasting, and I'm telling you the benefits. I maintain weight, I stay in my same weight, I fluctuate 5 to 10 pounds, because on the fast your body is squeezing everything out, and you're sitting there to dry. Now look at sponges and rags that you don't wring out and dry. What they do, they sit there in their own filth and rot and turn into disease filled whatever. Like he said in the beginning of this video, eating over 10 hours, 12 hours, 14-hour eating windows is the cause of all metabolic diseases. All the metabolic, even eating healthy foods, eating over these big windows, over 10 hours, not good. I was one of them. They used to, in the middle of the night, waking up, drinking pop, having a piece of candy, waking up, the first 30 minutes of waking up, eating something, drinking this. He said the most beneficial thing is the first hour you wake up, don't eat, and the last 3 hours before you go to sleep, do not eat. Biggest benefits. You start right there, that's a minimum baseline. I'm saying 3 and 3. 3 before you go to sleep and 3 after you wake up. You'll be at a supreme health. And on top of 8 hours of sleep, 3 and 3 on each side of that gives you excellent benefit. That's baseline what I try to do. I'm not perfect with it when I'm in my little window right now of chillaxing, but I know when it's time to work, putting eating to the side, the smaller windows is better for me. I got more energy. I'm saving money. Big time.
You're breaking your fast. If you eat purely fats, maybe, probably not. If you've been fasting for 5 hours or more, strictly fasting for 5 hours or more. So you can start to see where there's a lot of wiggle room, and it's very contextual. And this is why any post that you see or any information that you see that something does or does not break your fast, it doesn't place it in the context of when the last time you ate and what you ate and your activity and your time within the circadian clock schedule of 24 hours. It's a sort of meaningless discussion. So in general, I think what's really useful, if you're not going to wear a continuous glucose monitor, is to try and be fairly strict about when you initiate your feeding window and when you stop your feeding window. And as time evolves and you establish a more regular routine of eating certain kinds of foods and not others that are right for you, because as I've emphasized before on this podcast, and I will continue to emphasize, keto works great for some people. Vegetarian keto works great for some people. Carnivore diet works great for other people.
I don't promote carnivore.
Some people are omnivores, some people are carnivores, some people are vegan. All of that is great and fine by me. Everyone has to establish what's right for them. Today, we've really bypassed the discussion about foods of a particular origin or type, animal-based or plant-based. But all the same rules apply within this thing that we're called intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding. So what breaks a fast will depend. And what you want to eat or what you are willing to eat, that's a totally separate manner from when you eat. But as we've established, when you eat is vitally important. Glucose disposal agents, both behavioral and compound-based, things like metformin and berberine. And in fact, cinnamon is even a mild glucose disposal agent. It can actually reduce blood glucose. Lemon and lime juice, believe it or not, can lower blood glucose. You may have experienced this before, of eating something very, very sweet and almost feeling kind of overwhelmed and kind of poisoned by how sweet it is, especially if you're not accustomed to eating a lot of sugary things. One quick remedy for that is actually a half lime or a half lemon squeezed into juice and drinking that, just by virtue of the taste and by virtue of the fact that it will reduce blood glucose. You'll notice that effect almost immediately disappears.
Some people say
that's not magic. That's the effects of acidity on blood.
The remedy to live forever, and he just named a few of them too, cinnamon too, is you take a cup of warm water, dash of cinnamon, squeeze a little bit of lemon, and a scoop of honey. Some people say if you drink that every morning, he's just explaining how that's pretty much almost a metformin berberine, like lower level. If you do that every day, people that take the metformin can't work out on this, can't really you got to be doing nothing. It's gonna drop your energy level and give you a headache. But it's the same effect with the cinnamon and the lime. Same effect. You just said it. I can't believe you waited this long to say it.
Blood glucose levels. So there are a number of things that can adjust blood glucose. They're not necessarily disposal agents. They're not sweeping it out of the bloodstream in the same way that berberine or metformin would, or that high-intensity exercise at the appropriate times of day would. But there is one particular thing that one can ingest that can help manage psychologically and performance-wise through the fasting portion of the intermittent fasting and get you to your feeding window. And that's salt. I've talked a little bit about this on the podcast before, but because neurons use salt, sodium, and potassium, and magnesium, the so-called electrolytes, in order to perform their magic of chemical and electrical signaling. Everything you do depends on chemical and electrical signaling, and all that chemical and electrical signaling requires electrolytes in some form or another. Neurons run on the passage of ions like sodium in and out of their cell membranes, or I should say across their cell membranes, to be accurate. Many people find that the kind of lightheadedness, the shakiness that's accustomed with having slightly low blood sugar can be offset by taking a half teaspoon or so of sea salt, or even just a tiny pinch of salt, and putting into some water and drinking it. Some people find, because of the glucose lowering effects of acidity, that if they're feeling kind of shaky and not well and they put some lemon juice into water and drink that, it drops their blood glucose further. So there's a common practice nowadays that's discussed on the internet of waking up, drinking some water with some lime or lemon juice in it with a little pinch of salt. I think that little pinch of salt is a good idea. What is it doing? How is it offsetting all this? Well, salt water actually has a mild effect as a glucose disposal agent, but it has a stabilizing effect on blood volume. And so because sodium brings with it water, and the so-called osmolarity of your blood and your body depends on the salt levels in your blood and brain and body, many people find that if they're feeling shaky, they're feeling lightheaded, they can't concentrate, they think they need sugar or food, but what will actually remedy that is some salt. And I know a number of people that have incorporated this practice and have written to me and saying, oh, if I just take a little bit of salt and some water, they may or may not include the lemon or lime juice, they immediately feel better and find that it's actually quite straightforward to get out to wait until the feeding window kicks in. This is especially true for people that are using caffeine, because when you ingest caffeine, you actually excrete a lot of water, has a diuretic effect, and with that water goes salt, so it actually causes you to excrete sodium. Drinking seawater doesn't mean you should be overindulging in salt, but many people find that they can manage their mental and physical state and even feel really terrific, real clarity of mind, and really enjoy their fast when they're ingesting sufficient salt. And all it requires really is a small pinch of salt, ideally Himalayan or sea salt if you want to get fancy about it, but table salt would be fine. And just drinking that in some water, maybe with lemon or lime juice to offset the taste a little bit, can really stabilize one's jitters and can stabilize the mind. And you might also notice can offset that churning and yearning and appetite where you can't imagine going another 5 minutes before eating something. Suddenly you feel okay. And that has to do with a lot of the effects of blood volume caused by ingesting salt in the appropriate amounts. In other words, sometimes you think you need food, but what you really need is salt. And salt can make you feel better immediately post-meal. A few months back, I did an experiment wearing a continuous glucose monitor, and I got a surprise when I discovered that going into a sauna increases my blood glucose quite a bit. It actually spikes it as high as a meal, and then it tends to drop back down to baseline or even slightly below baseline afterwards.
This is my theory, because when you're in a sauna, you're breaking down fat deposit. Depending on what you ate to create the fat deposit and what's in there, it's like a meal for your body because you're burning energy at a high rate. So when you ate to create that fat, that'll be like a meal. Probably had a high sugar or a high whatever to give you an insulin spike and give you a glucose spike.
Science, you've heard a lot of examples, even a few anecdotes, and let's come up with the ideal intermittent fasting, aka time-restricted feeding schedule for you. And when I say ideal, I mean what are the variables that are negotiable? What are the ones that are non-negotiable? What is ideal for you will depend on the context of your life and what you are willing to do consistently. So, first of all, we established, based on the discussion with Sachin, who is truly the premier world expert in this area, who knows the animal and human scientific literature better than anybody, has written this incredible review, and for whom I consulted, that you do not want to ingest food for at least, I want to emphasize, at least 60 minutes post waking up. Second, you want to avoid ingesting any food of any kind, even 1 gram of sugar. Remember, this is the ideal. 1 gram of sugar even would be too much, for the 2 to 3 hours prior to bedtime. He also mentioned, ideally, you are spending 8 hours in bed. I didn't tell you that earlier. I saved that for now. But ideally, you're sleeping that entire 8 hours. But simply by being in bed for that 8 hours and avoiding food after waking for an hour and before bed for 2 to 3 hours, you're starting to build out the duration of this fasted period.
Mm-hmm.
An 8-hour feeding window as a target seems to be the best target feeding window.
Best.
At least by my read of the literature and in discussing it with Sachin. Shorter feeding windows of 4 to 6 hours tend to lead to overeating and potentially increases in weight.
So
1 meal per day type eating do not seem to do that, but those are special cases in that most people can't adhere to a 1 meal per day type schedule, at least not on a regular basis, and it's not very compatible with most social schedules. Although some people may be able to adhere to that in a straightforward way, but there aren't any robust studies exploring the advantages of 1 meal per day. So if you feel there are advantages of 1 meal per day for you, as opposed to an 8-hour feeding window, well then by all means, use a 1 meal per day approach, or use a 4 to 6 hour feeding window and just make sure you don't overeat in that window.
This is personally why I do big fasts and then do a little bit of small ones, and I stay into that big window, because once you go big into ketosis and then into autophagy and then to rejuvenation of your cells, like your body maintains this high level of burning and performance. Like you can feel it, because once you start eating heavier and not doing it, you feel like it's a huge hump to go back down, and your body won't allow it. Like you'll feel more bloated, even though you're still in your IBM. That you're gaining weight rapidly. Your body can tell. It's not like stupid. Like stop trying to play your body like that and ignoring certain things and listening to it, and it'll help you out in the end.
And this is simply based, or I shouldn't say simply, this is based on thousands, if not tens of thousands of human subject data points. Regular placement of the eating window or feeding window every 24 hours is important. You don't have to be absolutely rigid and neurotic about this, but you don't want it sliding around on the weekend so that it's starting 2 hours later and ending 2 hours later a couple days a week. Because then you start to offset many of the positive health effects that have been demonstrated. When should that 8-hour window be placed within each 24-hour cycle? Well, let's talk about ideal. Ideal, if you really want to maximize all the health benefits of time-restricted feeding, you need to extend the fast around sleep on both sides. You would place it smack dab in the middle of the day. It would be a schedule in which you started eating, for instance, at 10 a.m. and you stopped eating at 6 p.m. An absolutely dreadful schedule for anyone that wants to have some semblance of a normal life. In my opinion, it's not really compatible with most schedules, although some people might be able to do it. Maybe you and your family or your friends, you're eating a late breakfast and then you're having a late-ish lunch around 2 p.m. and then you have dinner at 6.
3 meals.
And then,
3 meals,
assuming that you go to bed around 9:30 or 10 p.m., that is going to extract the maximum amount of weight-related, body fat-related, metabolic factor-related aspects of time-restricted feeding.
Okay, let's go to the societies across the world that people aren't chunky everywhere and everybody aren't on the obese line and trying to figure out health problems. You see fasting. You see it religion-wise. You'll see it as a medical solution-wise. But over here in the U.S. and in these walls, you can't for some odd reason. And now this is groundbreaking stuff for some odd reason, when across the world you can find it. This is why I don't understand like doctors that are inside the U.S. that totally ignore how the Middle East and India and Asian countries, how they have a staple with fasting, and it doesn't get mentioned how they have research and they have tales. Not just ancient tales, but medical information backing intermediate fasting and prolonged fasting. They know smaller windows, and doing a big fast once a year gives you very beneficial, promising things. And nope, not inside the U.S. though. It needs to be on paper, clinically trial for decades before we even try it. But even though you can sit down and think about all the times that human evolution has went through famine because of nature wiping out all the plants and animals at the same time, and we had to rebuild societies, thinking about how humans have caused their own wars. And what's one of the ways inside of war tactics to get rid of another country? Oh, poison their food supply, poison their water supply, and still survive. Humans have been doing this for thousands of years. And you're telling me that people can't eat a smaller eating window? You're just adding into food addiction. And food addiction is like when you can't say, oh, I can't go a day without doing this. I can't go a few days without doing this. And it's clinically fact that, yeah, you can go a day. Starvation is into after day 35. So you're not starving and you're not hungry when we got resources of food at limited supply all around you. We literally got processed food. You can go anywhere to a free kitchen to get food, to where you can go work for food. Yeah, like food is unlimited everywhere, to where people are throwing it out. And you work at a job and you know you can't take food home to people, because of how the economy is set up, knowing that, if we give out the free leftover foods, it'll cripple the economy. That's how it works. We worked at jobs where we threw out food, and those people were like, can we give this to the homeless people? No. If you give out free food in a capitalist society, it's gonna cripple it. Plain and simple. So that's why they don't want you to play into the game of giving out this for free and trying to help, just because of the fact it is going to cripple, and they need these people to be addicted and these people to be suffering, so we can all feel this bullshit ass system.
People tend to fall into a category where they do best placing that feeding window later in the day, and provided it doesn't run too close to your sleep. Remember, you need a 2 or 3 hour buffer before your sleep where you're not ingesting anything. That's in order to extract the benefits of time-restricted feeding. Well, then, starting your feeding window at 12 p.m. and ending it at 8 p.m., plus or minus half an hour or so, day to day, seems like a perfectly reasonable schedule. For some people, starting at 2 p.m. and ending at 10 p.m. will be that schedule. Of course, you have to take into consideration when you exercise, if you exercise. For instance, I like to exercise early in the day if I run, or if I do some moderate or light intensity exercise, regardless of what type of exercise it is. I have no trouble waiting until my feeding window kicks in around noon or even 2 p.m. But if I do high intensity weight training, for instance, early in the day, or if I run sprints and I do that at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m., by 11 a.m. I am very, very hungry, and it's hard for me to do other things, concentrate, etc.
It's mental.
Now, I'm not neurotic about my feeding window. As I mentioned before, I kind of let it expand and contract a bit around the 8 hour mark, and feel perfectly free to do that too. We're talking here in ideals, not in necessarily practicals. But other people find that they're very hungry when they wake up early in the day. If you're one of these people, or you're somebody who really is trying to emphasize hypertrophy or maintenance of muscle, then it does seem that ingesting protein early in the day is beneficial. That it can be more readily converted into muscle tissue. And this has been demonstrated in at least one study. There's another study underway that's exploring this further. Be honest, there are many people out there who are eating 4 or more meals per day, and they're doing that from 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. I realize that not everybody is overweight. There is an obesity crisis, indeed.
Yes,
the percentage of obesity and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is just cosmic through the roof, at least in this country and in other countries as well.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
This country meaning the U.S., but other countries as well.
It's ridiculous how these certain things, like he said, diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver wasn't even popular 100 years ago. But now it's everywhere. It's through the roof. We can't control it. What happened in 100 years? 100 years ago, it was depression. People were starving to death, supposedly. But we was at war at the same time while people were starving to death. I think those numbers was kind of misconstrued when they were saying people were starving to death, but we was at war. And then people came home, and then the baby boomers exploded. doesn't make sense on how he's saying that when you are deprived, fertility rates are lower. But people came back from a war and fertility rates was high. It was because we was at war. That's why it was a little bit low. It wasn't because people were starving. And even at that time, people wasn't starving. People was healthy 100 years ago. But you never heard of non-alcoholic fatty liver or a trending with diabetes. The only people that had diabetes was literally people that was these certain type of people, pretty much. The lifestyle choices with what you eat. When you eat heavily but you don't work out, that's how your pancreas fails. Don't even have to work out, just staying active and being an active person on a regular day basis. That's what the biggest thing is. That's why they made gyms for people to be lazier. Oh, I can go here and burn out for two hours and don't have to do nothing else the rest of the day and sit at a laboratory. No, it's not life. It's not real life. You need to have an active lifestyle on a regular basis, either out and about or taking care of something that you're up and down about, meaning kids and animals, or going on far adventures if you want to. Like, I know how people are with hiking and camping and everything, like, and kayaking and climbing rocks and going on like very far out adventures. But it comes down to like, you got to be an active person, have control what you're eating, and not be eating at all times. Because you go back 100 years, these common things that are around today wasn't around. And if you look back, that's people had a cap on food because they knew you can't eat all day. You're not supposed to eat all day, every day, for 16 hours, and then sleep for 8 hours and wake up and repeat the same thing and sit on your ass and eat and be like, why am I 355 pounds? Well, you don't move, first of all, and you eat like you move every day. You eating a whole house full, and you not even working a whole house full. And I see that everywhere. Everywhere, misuse of food, just eating your favorite food, pleasing your palates. Now you overweight in this certain area. While your love handles are big and he got big titties and he a man. Yeah, because you eating this that's backing up your kidneys, and he eating this that's putting more fat around his titties, because that's what overdoing on eating estrogen dominant foods do to you. Then got some people that can't even feel their feet. Walking around, I can't feel my feet. Yep, I was doing that path. I have family members had to get legs cut off just because of it wasn't working no more, because there's no blood going down there. Blood go down and can't come back up because your heart ain't working, and heart disease, colon cancer, sitting on the toilet squeezing stuff out. You're sitting on the toilet and your stuff coming out like toothpaste, because you're squeezing so hard because your whole goddamn colon's swollen. Because you're constipated on a regular basis, and that's how people walk around here, and it's like, wow, you want to eat this stuff. Like I explain, always get 2 cups and put some fruit in the cup and see what that fruit would add to that water, and see what bread and salt and sugar does to that water. It absorbs it, it takes away. And people wonder why they're so constipated.
But there are, of course, people that are trying to gain weight, or who don't want to lose weight, or who are trying to maximize physical performance or hypertrophy or things of that sort. And so, of course, time-restricted feeding for them might be, as long as I'm awake, I'm eating. I tip my hat to those people and just say, provided you understand what you're doing and the burden that places on some of the other processes in your body, if that's right for you, then by all means pursue that. Another thing that we can add to this summary, or key points related to time-restricted feeding, is the use of glucose disposal agents and or behaviors. If you find that you've eaten too close to a period of time in which you would prefer to be fasting, that's when a 30-minute brisk walk or even modest walk after lemon juice or lime juice can help lower blood glucose somewhat. And then there are the things like metformin and berberine. There are even some supplements out there that combine things like berberine, cinnamon, which can lower blood glucose, and things like chromium and things that have a mild effect. And then, of course, we discussed how making sure that you're ingesting enough fluids, in particular water and salt, especially if you're using caffeine in order to increase your levels of alertness, regardless of where that caffeine source comes from, coffee, tea, or otherwise. That can cause the excretion of sodium and can lead to a kind of shakiness, a lightheadedness, and the feelings of hunger that may or may not be related to blood glucose. Some people genuinely need to eat. I certainly would not want to see people getting hypoglycemic to the point where it's dangerous. Certainly if you are diabetic, and in fact for all people, you should consult with your physician when exploring any major changes to diet or additions or subtractions.
Especially people that are deeply in some of this stuff. I have family members that would totally lie to their doctor. Like, oh, I stick to these eating windows, and knowing damn well they eat all types of bullshit. People lie to their doctors and their physicians all the time. All the time. Say this and then come home and say that. Well, in the report, the doctor's saying you say this. Oh, no, yeah, I'll be lying. Yeah. Why would you lie to the health? That's what people do.
Of anything, including supplementation. But for most people, maintaining relatively low to modest blood glucose levels is going to be pretty healthy and will allow all the positive effects of intermittent fasting to occur. And when you find that reaching that start to the feeding window is challenging, that ingesting sodium can often stabilize your system mentally and physically and allow you to reach that window, often painlessly. And then as a final point, as I mentioned earlier, provided that they are consumed in low, no, or modest amounts, artificial sweeteners or plant-based, non-sugar, non-caloric sweeteners don't seem to really impact blood glucose to the extent that it would, quote-unquote, take you out of your fast. But that, like fat fasting, is something that's going to be highly individual and that you're going to have to experiment with for yourself. And being able to recognize when you're in a fast and when you're out of a fast at a subjective level and not constantly having to measure your blood glucose or do things of that sort can be beneficial. And I think if you watch for the feelings associated with eating and post-eating foods of different kinds and different amounts, and you watch for the feelings associated with being fasted for long periods of time or short periods of time, of having...
Exactly. Watching for the feelings. Understanding, like, when you're in this insulin sensitive state, you need to understand how to work with that. And this is how to move. Understanding what a low glucose level is. And understanding how regulated blood sugar and blood pressure is. You'll be like, oh, this is a state I want to stay. That's what I'm saying. That higher level of energy, when everything is stable and your body regulates itself, like, get familiar in that and you will love it. Trust me. You're like, yo, what I gotta do to maintain this? Then you start sensing, like, oh, when I put this food in, this was happening. When I ate this food, man, I started sweating 10 minutes after. Like, you notice these certain foods, your body has to spike the heart rate, put more blood pressure on certain areas of your body so it can help push this through and do what it needs to do when there's other sources. Yeah, this may be good for you. This may be good for this person, may be bad for this person, may be good for this person. That's why the universe spread us out and all the plants out, all the food out, so we can have diversity. And that's what we need to understand in between everything, that diversity rules. When it comes to food and understanding information, people get so gung-ho on these tribes and these communities, and oh, we got the resources, we got the best, and like, no, you don't. The universe has the best, and that's what you got to submit to and understand. That's why I submitted to fasting, because it was like, yo, I'm gonna just put it in the faith of my body, so it literally can rejuvenate itself and regulate when I overeat, undereat, it'll balance out, because it's understanding, like, oh, we don't need this bad fat anymore. We only need healthy fat, which is this brown fat. He's explaining when you do it, when you're like literally in the suffering mindset of being in cold for periods of time, your body's like, oh, we don't need weak fat, we need strong fat. Your body's not eating all the time. Oh, we don't need weak fat, we need strong fat. Your body builds up this bulletproof point to where it be like, oh, we need to strengthen rather than being too soft and flexible to everything. That you need to be like strengthening yourself with the environment, because it's getting stronger, the sun's getting stronger, the plants are getting stronger. Even though we're depreciating it, it's still going to get stronger at the end of the day on the overall trend of it, because it has to keep up with the sun. Ain't trying to keep up with us. I mean, the planet ain't trying to keep up with humans. It's trying to keep up with the sun and the universe. So we're trying to dumb it down so we can make it easier for us to live, when we should be trying to keep up with the universe. Plain and simple.
Gotten sufficient sunlight, of having trained hard or not trained hard earlier that day, etc., you can do the most important thing, which is to start to learn to evaluate your own system, to run simple, safe experiments on your system in a way that allows you to really establish the ideal nutrition schedule for you, whether it be time-restricted feeding, aka intermittent fasting, or some other nutritional plan.